Humanity has fought wars against animals before, against locusts, against rats, against wolves. Sometimes we won, sometimes we didn't. But nothing quite prepared us for what happened when India went to war against high IQ crows. Thousands of predators were released to fight them, and the crows were ready. It didn't go the way anyone planned, and the part that should disturb you is not just that it failed, it's what the crows did next. The enemy. What crows are actually doing to India. India has a crow problem so severe that entire communities have restructured their lives around it. These birds breed fast, eat anything, and live everywhere humans live. Cities, airports, hospitals, farms. Wherever people are, crows follow, and the damage they leave behind is not small. There is a man named Shiva Kawat who lives in a small village in northern India. A few years ago, he found a baby crow trapped in a wire fence. He tried to save it. The chick died in his hands. The other crows saw it happen, and they made a decision. Kawat was a killer, and from that day forward, every time he steps outside his house, they come for him, not one or two. A coordinated swarm, diving at his head, raking him with their claws, screaming. The man is covered in scars. He carries a stick just to wave them off. But they do not stop. They have never stopped. What makes this deeply unsettling is that this is not random aggression. The crows identified his face. They briefed other crows. And they have been running targeted attacks on one specific man for years. Now scale that up to an entire country. Crows in India have forced commercial flights to divert mid-approach. One flight to Pune airport was redirected just 10 minutes before landing. Another sat grounded for 6 full hours waiting for the runway to clear. In hospital wards across the country, crows have been found entering open windows, landing near patients, pulling at wound dressings. The infection risk alone was enough to alarm medical staff. Then came the study that made Indian scientists go very quiet. Researchers captured 100 house crows and examined what was living inside them. They found salmonella bacteria, but not ordinary salmonella. What they found were strains resistant to fluoroquinolones, which are the antibiotics doctors use when everything else has stopped working. In plain terms, these birds were carrying a version of salmonella that modern medicine struggles to treat. And they were landing on food markets, hospital rooftops, and schoolyards every single day. The crop damage added another layer. Crows were cutting farm yields by more than 55% in some regions. Grape harvests in Himachal Pradesh were being torn apart. Not just eaten, destroyed. The birds ruin what they do not eat, which means entire harvests become worthless. And underneath all of this was a quieter damage. And cray that nobody measured officially. Families in crow-heavy areas stopped letting children play outside. People woke up to cawing before sunrise and fell asleep to it. Communities began reorganizing their daily lives around the movements of birds. This was not a pest problem anymore. It had grown into something far beyond that. And the worst part was still coming. But before anyone could figure out how to fight them, they needed to understand something that changed everything about the problem. These crows were not just numerous, they were thinking. The high IQ problem. Why crows cannot be outsmarted. In Davis, California, researchers watch crows drop walnuts from different heights depending on the type of nut. Hard black walnuts were dropped from higher up, softer English walnuts from lower. Both were aimed precisely at hard road surfaces so the shells would crack cleanly. When fewer crows were around to steal the prize, a crow would fly higher so the nut would take longer to fall, giving it time to land before a rival got there. These birds were calculating height, shell hardness, and competition simultaneously. That is not instinct. That is applied reasoning. In Japan, carrion crows figured out something even more remarkable. They began placing walnuts on road crossings, waiting for cars to run them over, and then collecting the cracked nuts when the traffic stopped. What made this genuinely disturbing was not the behavior itself. It was what happened next. No human taught any other crow this technique. It spread from bird to bird, city to city, entirely on its own. That is not adaptation. That is culture. But intelligence alone is not what made India's situation so difficult to solve. What made it nearly impossible was crow memory. Researchers at the University of Washington ran an experiment. They had people wear a specific mask while capturing and tagging crows. Afterwards, whenever anyone wore that mask near those crows, the birds attacked. They dive-bombed, screamed, and followed the masked person across large distances. 5 years later, they were still doing it. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Crows that had never personally been captured also attacked the mask. They had learned about the threat from other crows. The information was passed down the way a warning gets passed through a community. Someone experienced it, told others, and the knowledge stuck. Now apply that to India's control campaigns. Every time authorities shot crows, the ones that survived did not scatter and stay gone. They watched, identified patterns in how the hunters moved and where they operated, and avoided those specific zones and those specific people while continuing everywhere else. Each campaign did not reduce the crow population so much as it refined it. The birds that survived were the ones smart enough to survive, and they taught their young. This is what researchers call the elite survivor effect. You wipe out part of the population, and what remains is a group of birds that have passed a brutal test. They are more cautious, more observant, and more effective at staying alive than the birds that came before them. Every failed control campaign was, without anyone intending it, a selection process. India was running that process over and over again, and each time the crows that came out the other side were harder to kill. The deeper you went into the research, the more unsettling it became. Crows hide food from other crows. They check whether they are being watched before choosing a hiding spot. If they know another crow saw them, they move the food after that crow leaves. That level of social calculation requires a crow to model what another crow is thinking. Scientists call this theory of mind, and it is a cognitive ability that most animals on Earth do not possess. India was not dealing with a pest. It was dealing with a distributed intelligence that learned faster than any program deployed against it. So the question that was sitting in the room, the one nobody had a clean answer to, was this: if you cannot outsmart them, cannot outshoot them, and cannot poison them into submission, what do? You bring in something they are genuinely afraid of. And the idea for what that something could be came not from India, but from a wire cage in the Scottish Highlands. The moment that started everything. A gamekeeper in Highland Scotland set a crow trap near a trail. The trap was a larcen trap, a wire cage built around one brutal insight about crows. You place a live crow inside. That crow calls out in distress. Other crows hear it and come, not for food, not for bait. They come because one of their own is in trouble. The trap does not fool them. It uses their loyalty against them, and it works every time. 7 crows had fallen for it by the time the gamekeeper looked through his binoculars. He made a note to return and deal with them. Then his wife called and he had to leave. He was gone for 40 minutes. When he came back, the trap was silent. He walked closer. The cage was not open. It was not broken. It was empty. On the floor sat a pile of feathers and 7 pairs of feet, arranged there with a stillness that did not look like escape. He looked again and saw it. Sitting on the cage floor, completely still, was a golden eagle. An enormous bird with an 8-foot wingspan had squeezed through the narrow funnel in the cage roof, killed all 7 crows in under 40 minutes, and was now sitting too full to move. When the gamekeeper finally opened the cage, the eagle could barely lift off the ground. 7 intelligent birds that had come to help one of their own, and every one of them was dead. What the gamekeeper did not know, and what researchers would later document, is that golden eagles are capable of what scientists call surplus killing. In enclosed spaces where prey cannot escape, these birds do not stop at hunger. They kill because the opportunity is there, and nothing stops them. What happened in that cage may not have been about food at all. It may have been pure, unchecked instinct. There is a dark irony sitting underneath this moment that almost nobody talks about. Golden eagles in the Scottish Highlands had been systematically poisoned and persecuted for generations by gamekeepers protecting game estates. The very profession of the man standing at that cage had nearly wiped this bird off the map. And now one of those same birds had walked into a trap and done in 40 minutes what years of human effort had failed to accomplish. The idea that followed was straightforward. If one eagle did this to 7 crows by accident, what would a deliberate, coordinated deployment do to thousands? The logic felt clean. Stop fighting the crows with guns and poison and noise. Send in the eagle. It seemed at that moment like the answer everyone had been waiting for. What nobody asked loudly enough was the question on the other side. What happens to the eagle once it is out there? And what happens to everything else living near it? Releasing the predators. The most ambitious attempt to weaponize raptors against crows happened not in a highland field, but inside an Indian police unit. In the southern state of Telangana, authorities created a specialized raptor unit and named it Garuda, after the mythical solar bird from Hindu legend, a divine eagle said to be the destroyer of serpents and the protector of order. The name was chosen deliberately. 5 eagles were recruited. Training ran for more than 3 years. These birds were conditioned to intercept fast-moving aerial threats on command, initially to take down rogue drones near VIP events and large public gatherings. It was the first unit of its kind in India. Only one other country had ever done something similar. That country was the Netherlands. Here is the part that should have made everyone stop. The Dutch program, which Garuda was modeled after, had already been shut down before Garuda ever launched. The eagles had stopped following commands in field conditions. They began making their own decisions about what to hunt and when. They showed signs of behavioral stress. The program that inspired India's most sophisticated raptor deployment had quietly collapsed. And almost nobody in the conversation about Garuda mentioned it. In Kenya, the approach was even more blunt. House crows had been introduced to Zanzibar at the end of the 19th century to clean up food waste, another decision made with good intentions that detonated over time. With no natural predators on the East African coast, the population exploded. By January 2024, more than 12,000 crows had been counted in a single Kenyan town. The government set a target of killing 1 million birds and began deploying a poison called starlicide, first developed in the United States, designed to break down inside the crow's body before death so that scavengers eating the carcass would not be harmed. What was not widely reported was that raptors feeding on dying crows before the compound fully broke down were also affected. The poison campaign that was supposed to protect native bird species was killing the very predators that could have naturally controlled the crows. Kenya was removing its own safety net without realizing it. In Portland, Oregon, professional falconers were hired to patrol the city with trained birds during the months when crow roosts reached their worst. At peak, those roosts held around 15,000 birds in a single area. The falcons flew regular circuits and the crows moved. But when the results were studied properly, the crow population in the Portland region had not declined. It had relocated. The birds shifted to parks and green zones outside the center. The problem was not solved. It was redirected. Across these programs, spanning multiple continents and multiple decades, thousands of trained raptors were deployed, and hundreds of thousands of crows were killed or displaced. The investment was enormous, the confidence was high, and in each case something went wrong that nobody had fully predicted, because the crows were not sitting still while all of this was happening. They were watching, they were learning, and they were preparing a response that nobody had planned for. The crows that learned from the war. There is a research finding that sits at the center of this entire story, and it is the one that changes everything. Scientists studying crow populations that had been repeatedly targeted by predator deployment programs found something that nobody wanted to see. The crows were not being worn down. They were getting better. Their mobbing behavior was becoming faster and more coordinated. Their ability to pass threat information between flocks was improving. Their response time to aerial predators was shortening with each generation. The predator deployment programs were not defeating the crows. They were training them. To understand why this is so devastating, you need to understand what crow mobbing actually looks like. When one crow spots a predator, it does not flee. It lands somewhere visible, opens its beak, and screams. Within 60 seconds, a flock assembles and launches a coordinated assault. They dive from above, peck at the back of the head, scream continuously, and rotate attackers so the predator never gets a moment of rest. Very often, the eagle retreats, a bird with an 8-foot wingspan built to kill, driven off by animals a fraction of its size. What makes this even harder to process is that crows will mob dead predators. They will mob a stuffed owl. They have been observed attacking the same decoy for years without stopping. This is not pure defense. This is practice. Every eagle deployed into crow territory was also, without anyone intending it, a live training drill for every crow watching it. That knowledge transferred to the next generation before those young crows ever left the nest. Crow chicks hear their parents' alarm calls. They watch the mobbing behavior from the safety of the nest. They encode the shapes of enemies and the correct responses before they ever fly on their own. A generation raised under eagle pressure emerged already knowing how to fight eagles. The programs that were supposed to break the crows were building harder ones instead. Then came Ethiopia. In 2019, near the town of Gashamo, a martial eagle attacked a group of children. One child died. 2 others were left with serious injuries. The bird was eventually killed, though accounts of how differ. Some say it was shot. Others say a teenager fought it off with a stick and finished it himself. This was not a theoretical risk in a research paper. This was a child who did not survive an encounter with the same category of bird that governments were actively considering releasing near populated areas. And it was not isolated. There are documented attacks by large eagles on children in Zambia and Uganda. Forensic anthropologists have found talon puncture marks from crowned eagles on ancient human skull fragments, which means large raptors were hunting our ancestors millions of years before the first cage was ever built in Scotland. This relationship was always dangerous. It never stopped being dangerous. In Australia, a wedge-tailed eagle, introduced near farmland to control feral animals, became progressively bolder over 2 years. It went from avoiding humans to tolerating them to actively targeting livestock. It had to be destroyed. The war had arrived somewhere nobody intended. The predators were becoming threats. The crows were becoming stronger. And every solution deployed had made at least one part of the problem significantly worse. The unresolved war. Where this ends, and why no one knows. Here is where things stand right now. House crows are listed among the most destructive invasive species on the planet. They are established across South Asia, East Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. Their population is still growing, and every tool available to fight them has a documented failure attached to it. Shooting creates elite survivors who are harder to kill than the birds before them. Trapping only works when numbers are still small, which they no longer are anywhere that matters. Poison risks killing raptors and other animals, quietly dismantling the natural systems that could have helped. Wild predator release produces birds that stop targeting crows and eventually become dangers to livestock, pets, and in documented cases, children. Trained raptor programs either collapse under real-world conditions, as the Netherlands discovered, or relocate crows without reducing them, as Portland showed. India's Garuda unit is still operational. 5 eagles, 1 state, tens of millions of crows. The math does not work, and everyone involved knows it. What sits at the core of this problem is time. Crow populations operate on a learning curve that outlasts every human program deployed against them. A government campaign runs for a season, maybe 2, then funding ends, attention moves elsewhere, and the program stops. The crows do not stop. They were there before the campaign, and they are there after it. Every generation that lives through a control attempt comes out the other side, knowing more about how to survive the next one. The question nobody has cleanly answered is what happens when the crows around Garuda's patrol zone finish mapping the eagle's flight patterns and response behaviors. Because based on everything documented about how these birds process and share information, that is not a question of whether. It is a question of when. What started with 7 dead crows in a wire cage in Scotland became one of the most complicated wildlife conflicts on Earth. Predators were released, thousands of them, across multiple countries, over multiple decades. Some crows died, many more moved, and the ones that stayed learned something from every single encounter. The crows are still out there. The programs have come and gone. And the birds that survived every one of them are already teaching their young exactly what to do when the next predator arrives. If every method humanity has tried has only made them stronger, what exactly are we building toward? If that question unsettles you as much as it should, like this video and subscribe. We find the stories that are still unfolding,